Good morning, everybody. This is Justin Dunn. We're going to get started here in just a couple minutes. People are still rapidly joining, so we want to give them time to get signed on and get comfy. So we'll get started here in just a couple minutes. So stay tuned. All right, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. We still have people joining, but we're going to get going. Welcome to our ADA compliance webinar, Drinking Fountains and ADA, your guide to compliance. Our goal today is we're going to explain the Americans with Disabilities Act and its requirements and how it affects your designs and your installation of specifically drinking fountains, but these apply to much more than just that. So keep in mind too that you have local and state laws to adhere to as well. So ensure that those are taken into consideration. State and local laws must be more strict than what is currently in place at the federal level, which is what we are covering today, the federal standard. My name is Justin Dunn. I am the Sales Product Specialist and Trainer for Haws. Running the webinar behind the scenes is Nicole Dennison, our Marketing Manager here at Haws. All attendees are going to be on mute for the presentation. Once the presentation is complete, we will have a Q&A, and I'll be answering as many questions as you've submitted as possible. I'll try to get to all of them. It's really unlikely. We always get lots of questions, but after the webinar, we'll be sure to follow up with those. So feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar by using the question section on the control panel. All questions, if not answered during the Q&A, will be answered in a follow-up email that will be sent post-webinar. We will be launching poll questions throughout the webinar, not too many, and Nicole and I greatly appreciate your participation in those to help us to continue to improve the webinar for you and future attendees. In that follow-up email, you're going to receive the following. You'll get the on-demand recording, the presentation slides, additional support materials, and then CEU instructions through ABIH, AIA, and ASPE, just to ensure that you know how to interact with us to ensure that you receive credit for attending the webinar. Okay, just to give everybody a brief history on Haws, our founder, Luther Haws, invented the modern day drinking fountain in 1906. Formed the Haws Sanitary Drinking Fountain Company in 1909 in Berkeley, California. We'd since moved to Sparks, Nevada. Given this company's history with hydration and innovation, we thought we were pretty uniquely situated to present all this information to you, which is why we host this webinar to help educate everybody. Luther was actually working as a sanitation inspector for Berkeley when he had the thought to invent a device that would prevent users from putting their mouth on the device used to take a drink. Now, public fountains before the first bubbler head was invented were typically a constantly running fountain, which isn't that uncommon today or in the rest of the world. It's typically a spigot that sometimes had a cup attached via a chain that you would pick up, fill, take a drink, and then you would drop it, leave it for the next person. And the problem with this is that it was really gross. And luckily for us, Luther Haws put his mind to the task and created a simplistic solution to solve the problem and greatly improved public sanitation very quickly as the idea and the invention spread from coast to coast. And now it's standard. Our agenda today is going to include the overview of the ADA legislation for drinking fountains, common ADA installation issues. I've got some examples. We try to do a great job here of including instructions and educating, but sometimes these fountains get into people's hands and they're still like, I don't know, I'm going to throw away the instructions. And they provide me with really great examples. So ADA compliant drinking fountain and bottle filler installations, and then we'll end with that Q&A. And I'll get to as many as I possibly can. We usually run out of time and can't get to all of them, but I assure you we'll answer those and send them in a follow-up email too. Okay, so we're going to kick off with our first poll question. Nicole, if you would kickstart that, please.
Okay. All right. What is your role when it comes to specifying drinking fountains? If this does not apply to you, please just do not respond. We'll just give it a couple more seconds here. All right. All right, guys, thanks for your participation.
Okay, here we go. So now for the history lesson portion of this webinar. Let's see here. I think we're having Nicole's telling me we're having a little issue here. Give me just a second. We're going to correct this before we get launched into the information. And fixed. Luckily, Nicole was on that. She knew exactly what was wrong and has it fixed. So hopefully that doesn't happen after the next poll question, but we know what to do now. So let's get started. So we're going to start with a really quick history lesson on the ADA before we launch into this, before I start throwing numbers and measurements at you. First and foremost, and most importantly to remember, is that the 2010 ADA standards are civil rights legislation. Prior to the standard and its inception, accessibility was borderline a joke. It was terrible. Access to buildings, to basic human necessities was an afterthought. There weren't any teeth in the requirements to provide access to buildings and grounds for an entire class of people that were being very heavily neglected. But thanks to people like Justin Dart, founder of Dart Industries and responsible for a few brands that you're probably familiar with, like Duracell, Tupperware, etc. He was one of the biggest advocates for the movement and was often referred to as the grandfather of the ADA. He was actually disabled himself. And alongside Mr. George H.W. Bush, not disabled, who was the sitting president at the time when the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law by he himself on July 26, 1990. And this new act granted reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities and provided or prohibited discrimination based on their disabilities. It's actually a pretty cool story, and it's hard to believe now, but they were met with pretty strong resistance when they initially proposed these changes. With all that said, let's get into it. The Americans with Disabilities Act, 28 CFR Part 36, Title III, regarding public accommodations and commercial facilities and its requirements are enforced by none other than the Department of Justice. Title III is going to be our focus today. The following are the key sections of the standard pertaining to drinking fountains and their compliance. Also remember that Nicole is going to send out these slides to everyone after the presentation, so you can reference them later. Oh, and real quickly, since I always get asked, Title II actually covers state and local government, and Title I has more to do with discrimination for disabled employees. That's always a Q&A question. I'd like to start by talking about Section 36.403. It's actually skipping ahead a little bit into the standard, but this gives us a list of priorities when making alterations to provide accessibility in a facility. And you're going to notice that in the list, drinking fountains takes a pretty high priority, even over accessible parking. So the entrance, the route, restrooms, public telephones, fountains, as well as parking, storage, and alarms are all high priority items and basic human necessities when navigating the world. All walks of life, all people everywhere need water. And it's right at the top of the list of things we need to survive. And we need to ensure that it's accessible to everybody, which is why it makes such a high priority on this list. Chapter 1, Section 102 just lets us know that this document contains both adult and children's requirements based on the anthropometrics, which is just a fancy word for measurements of the human body. Children are defined as age 12 or younger in the ADA. I've got examples later on in the presentation for both adult and children's heights. By the age of 13, typically children have sprouted up tall enough that they can access adult standing drinking fountains just as easily. This section explains that where there is one fountain, typically a high side fountain, that there must be two fountains. Local building codes determine the number of drinking fountains that must be installed based on occupancy. This simply states that there must be a high fountain and a low fountain. What most don't understand is that the low side fountain is not the only one designed for people with disabilities. The high side fountain is also a disabled accessible fountain designed for those with bending and stooping disabilities that may be utilizing a walker, a cane, crutches, and may not be able to physically utilize the low side fountain. Other than aesthetics, drinking fountains are not designed for able-bodied people. It's reasonable to think or to assume that if you are able-bodied that you can take a drink of whichever fountain you choose. You could do a backflip and take a drink. The fountains are also for you, but they're not designed for you. So if you are installing a single fountain in your facility or in a park, you must satisfy this ADA requirement and install a second fountain. There must be one of each. They don't need to be next to each other. They can be separated or on either end of a hallway, but they both must be present and accessible. To 11.3, this section is referred to as the 50-50 rule. And it simply states that half of the units installed shall be high fountains and the other half shall be low fountains. For example, if you are installing 6 new fountains in your building, you couldn't do 4 high fountains and 2 low fountains. You must provide 3 high and 3 low, 50-50. There is an exception to this rule, though, and that's where that number yields a fraction. In another example, given the previous requirement, we'll assume that you have met the requirement for drinking fountains for the property and have decided to add another drinking fountain on top of that. giving you 7 fountains. The 7th fountain can be either high or low. It's entirely your choice, so long as you have the 3 high and 3 low meeting the previous requirement. The last one, if it's a fraction, it's entirely up to you. In Chapter 3, we get started into dimensional and mechanical elements. You're going to hear me use the term elements a whole bunch throughout the entire presentation. An element can be any of the devices that we are granting access to. This can be a drinking fountain, this can be a phone, fire extinguisher, baby changing table, many other things. Many of the measurements that we're going to go over apply to every single one of these elements, not just fountains, but fountains is the subject that we're focusing on here. This is probably one of the most important measurements to remember in the ADA, and very frequently the section being violated in tear out and reinstalls. 305.3 and 305.5. These detail clear ground space to accommodate the wheelchair underneath the fountain. This allows for an approach that is unobstructed to the fountain. You must provide a 30 by 48 inch space. It's actually a 3-dimensional space, but I'll go over that here in a moment. 30 by 48 inches of clearance underneath that element, which is just larger than your typical adult size wheelchair. Giving the user clearance for clear space for the wheelchair and for their hands to maneuver into that space. We don't want them maneuvering into the space and bumping or hitting their hands on the wing walls or the alcove or anything like that. So there's got to be plenty of space for them to maneuver in and out of this area, right? It's got to be reasonable. And 30 by 48 inches is the minimum amount of clear space underneath that element. So for 305.5, again, this is an example that really clearly demonstrates clear ground space in front of an element. In this case, a telephone and a fire extinguisher. 305.5 explains that the positioning of this clear ground space allows for either a forward approach like the one you see on the left, or for a parallel approach, which can be easier in some instances and situations, as you can see on the right side there. Now, keep in mind that the 30 by 48 inches going forward, that it is very frequently the cause for many poor installations and compliance issues. Remember also that these are minimum requirements. The more space you can provide, the better. Again, we want to make this as easy as possible for somebody to maneuver in and out of. Now, when the element is in an alcove, like in the examples above, wheelchair users are going to need additional space to maneuver, and the clear floor space changes based on the depth of that alcove. And the type of approach that you have. So in the first example, if an alcove is in place, our 30 by 48 inches becomes 36 by 48 inches when the depth of the alcove exceeds 24 inches. And that's because it's deeper. You're going to need more room to maneuver in and out of that space. And in the second, for a parallel approach, when the depth of the alcove exceeds 15 inches, then our clear floor space must be 30 by 60 inches, allowing them to maneuver in and out. Since it's for a parallel approach, this is a little bit more difficult. They're going to need a wider space from front to back for the wheelchair to get in and out of that area. Now, currently only 2 states that I'm aware of require the use of alcoves, and they are California and Texas. Many other states have followed suit. It just makes sense for these elements to be out of the path of travel, but more on that shortly. It's really, I think, the way that most standards should go to. The alcove is perfect, both for the sight impaired, wheelchair bound, et cetera, and for these elements to remove them out of the path of travel. Extending up from our clear ground space are our toe and knee clearance. This is what I was talking about when I mentioned a 3-dimensional space. So we have our 30 by 48 inches of clear ground space on the floor, but we need to accommodate the toes and the knees underneath the fountain, or whatever the element is. giving people enough space to approach the element, especially if it's on a countertop. That can be pretty difficult when you're in a wheelchair and your knees are static in the chair. You cannot maneuver around any objects underneath it, so we need to make enough space. Now our toe clearance is 9 inches from the ground to the bottom of the element, and our knee clearance is 27 inches from the ground up. Obstructions in the yellow highlighted area are another, again, unfortunately common compliance issue. I've got some great examples that we've found later in our presentation. This space needs to be clear, and it's got to include space between the victim's knees as well. I get this question all the time, and yes, this counts as an obstruction shoot. So like P-traps, hanging phone books, or anything else is not allowed to be between their knees inside of that space. That doesn't count as clear ground space or knee space. You can't have anything in that yellow box. Okay, so we're on to poll question number 2. Nicole, if you would start that, please.
Okay, unmute works. Which brands do you specify most in your facility? Again, if this does not apply to you, please just leave it blank.
We'll see if we make the presentation angry again here and it kicks us out, but I think we should be good once we continue.
Okay, I'll just give it one more second and we'll go ahead and wrap it up. All right, Justin.
Sure enough, it got upset again. And Nicole's fixing it. Here we go. Okay, so on to the next section. 307 pertains to protruding objects and is primarily in place to protect another type of protected class that we haven't touched on yet, and that class is the vision impaired. Elements may not protrude into a walkway so much and must be located at certain heights, whether they are in an alcove or not. This isn't to prevent anyone in that walkway from running into these elements. Objects with these leading edges, the lowest point on the front of the element, above 27 inches, may only protrude a maximum of 4 inches into the path of travel. But so long as the leading edge of the element is at or under 27 inches, then this is considered to be detectable by a detection cane, according to the Department of Justice, the DOJ. Here's one of my favorite illustrations that I stole and I take credit for. On the bottom right, we see an object very similar to a drinking fountain, and so long as its leading edge is at or below the 27-inch line, it can be detected through the use of a detection cane, early enough to be avoided and to prevent potential injury. So this fountain and any element, so long as it is meeting the 27-inch requirement, can protrude any amount into this space because it's detectable. The same rule applies for elements at or above 80 inches from the floor. This is considered headroom clearance, and similar to the previous example, can extend any amount into this space. If you're taller than 6'8", then I'm sorry, the expectation is that you are going to detect these objects with your head, apparently, but not very common in public spaces. And all of these measurements are based on, again, average human anthropometrics. On the left, we have an object sitting above 27 inches and below 80 inches. And as it's not above headroom clearance and it cannot be detected by a cane, these objects can't protrude from that space any more than 4 inches. unless it's a handrail, which are allowed to protrude 4.5 inches. These types of objects would be like a recessed fire extinguisher, recessed phone, recessed bottle filler on the wall, things like that. They're only allowed to protrude so far from that space, being directly in an area where they cannot be detected. Next, I'm going to use our 1011 HPS, that's for high polished, and SK3, our cane skirt, for this next example. This is a dual, it's a high-low unit, typically installed in high traffic customer facing areas because of its mirror finish, and it's a great example for what your typical high-low ADA installation looks like. The SK3 cane skirt that you see on the bottom of the left-hand side there is what we need to discuss. Where drinking fountains cannot be alcoved out of the path of travel, a cane skirt must be used to lower the leading edge of the high side fountain to 27 inches to make the object detectable by a detection cane. Now, when using a detection cane, if unassisted, you are generally following what is referred to as a shoreline or outermost edge of a space. Since the visually impaired may need to detect something on either side of the room, they may be traveling in either direction. And without the cane skirt in place, there will likely be incidents where people will run into the high side fountain or have a difficult time finding and detecting it, which is why we use the cane skirt. Many states still don't fully utilize alcoves, and until they do, cane skirts are the answer for that. Section 308 in the ADA covers reach ranges. Another important requirement when something like a bottle filler is installed or when things like baby changing stations are installed. The slide is pretty straightforward. If your reach is unobstructed, like in the photo on the left-hand side there, then you have a 48-inch max and 15-inch minimum reach range. Any buttons, handles, sensors, etc. have to be located within this range. But as soon as we introduce an object, our reach ranges are going to be diminished, right? We're reaching over something. Something is obstructing our reach to the wall, high or low. When an object is shorter than 20 inches, and when that's in place, we keep our 48-inch high reach range, but our low reach disappears since we now have the fountain or another element in place obstructing our low reach range. When reaching over an object that is 20 to 25 inches or high, our reach range is shortened to only 44 inches. Generally speaking, drinking fountains are shorter than 20 inches, so the middle example would be what our reach ranges are going to be usually. Remember, we want to make things as easy as possible, though. We don't need to create a challenge or obstacle course for the disabled person. And we want to make sure that if there are objects such as bottle fillers, soap dispensers, things like that over an object, that they are well within those reach range maximums. This DOJ advisory actually defines reach ranges for children based on age. Remember, children are defined as ages 12 and under in the ADA. These reach ranges apply to both forward and parallel approach to an element. Starting on the left, ages 3 through 4 have a high-low range of 36 to 20 inches. 5 to 8 have 40 to 18 inches, and ages 9 to 12 have a 44 to 16 inch reach. Obviously, as they grow, their arm reach range grows as well, extending their reach. Ages over 12 are expected to utilize adult height drinking fountains. The only place you'll typically find these, though, is in the school system, daycare facilities, and the like, where many children are supervised, but there are fewer adults. In public, the expectation is really that an adult is going to be present to assist the child with using fountains or any other elements, right? In Chapter 6, we're going to get into the specifics regarding the plumbing elements and their measurements. So first off, 602.2 covers clear floor space and the necessity to have that clear floor space centered on the unit. This is really important, and not centered on the alcove. I have some examples of installations that miss the mark on this coming up. This is for a forward approach as a parallel approach needs to be set up differently. Obviously, our toe and knee clearance must also be available underneath there. There is an exception included here for parallel approaches to children's use units. Knee and toe clearance begins to diminish pretty quickly as we lower the fountains for children's use. So the use of a parallel approach is really important, especially considering that the children's wheelchairs are frequently adult wheelchairs. Custom-sized wheelchairs they can be really expensive, and they can pretty quickly outgrow them. So a parallel approach helps to solve this issue, allowing you access to the fountain without really having to take too much consideration into that toe and knee clearance. This is just a really good illustration of that, the floor space and how they have to be centered on the elements. As far as the fountain goes, since the clear floor space is intended for the wheelchair user, it is centered on the left low side fountain. And since there's no real floor space defined in black and white for the high side, the floor space can spill over under the high side fountain as much as is needed. Many make the mistake of centering the clear floor space on the alcove, which leads to pretty expensive tear-outs and redesigns. If you center that space on the alcove, the likelihood that you've intruded on the low side drinking fountain's clear floor space is really highly likely. So remember that clear floor space is intended to be directly underneath whatever the element is that we're granting access to, not the space. Here you can see we have a total width of 48 inches in this alcove. It's not deeper than 24 inches, so we don't need to expand on our 30-inch floor space width. You will, however, notice that it shows a separate measurement for California. In typical fashion, California decided to do their own thing, and they made their standard requirements 2 inches of additional floor space, bumping up the width of the floor space to 32 inches. So long as the state requirements go above and beyond the federal standards, they can supersede them. So 32 inches in California width for the clear floor space, 30 inches at a federal level for everybody else until they decide to increase that bare minimum. To center the fountain in the alcove correctly, which is not mandatory, by the way, but is typically done so that it's aesthetically pleasing, right? It's going to look much better if it's centered on the alcove instead of shoved over to one side. So we would need 28 inches of total width of the alcove in California and 46 inches anywhere else. If the alcove was deeper than 24 inches, remember that we would need a total of 36 inches of ground clearance centered on the low side drinking fountain. Okay, and that's only if that alcove is to go any deeper than that, right? Because they're going to need additional maneuvering space. Center line to center line on these fountains, they're separated by 16 inches, which means we need an additional 18 inches of space on either side total to meet our 36-inch minimum and for the fountain to be centered. So if they weren't, again, worried about the fountain being centered, they had a smaller alcove and they still wanted to fit this drinking fountain setup inside of that alcove, they could shove the high side fountain over up against the wall, giving us more space, more room for the clear floor space for the low side drinking fountain. Since there's no obstructions under the high side fountain, our primary concern is that wall. Remember, if it's at all intruding into our floor space, the alcove would need to be redesigned or the fountain would need to be, again, shoved over so that the high side is closer to the alcove wall, giving us our clear floor space centered on the low side unit. The fountain might be a little off center, but you'd be compliant. We should remember that the high side fountain is also for those with disabilities, and they may need the assistance of, again, walkers, crutches, canes, and we need to leave room for that equipment underneath the high side fountain. Plus, it looks super funny if you shove it over against the wall. To be fair, again, if there is an agreed upon number for the high side floor clearance, but I'll get into that later. I have an example that I'll throw up on the screen for everybody. Okay, we're on poll question number 3. I think it's fair to say at this point that everybody should expect a brief disruption in the webinar after this, but we'll get it going as quick as possible.
All right, yeah, sorry about that technical difficulties. I'm not sure what's going on here. Okay, poll question number 3. What is the most important benefit to your clients when selecting drinking fountains? All right, get those votes in and we'll give you just a couple more seconds here. All right, guys, thanks for voting.
See that? We're getting faster. All right, we were prepared that time. Okay, here we go. So poll question number 3 is done. Thanks again for doing that. All those answers really help us to help better this product and make it something that's worthwhile for your time. So this slide is an excerpt from the California Building Code, and what they have done, along with Texas and a few of the other states, is again they've made it mandatory to locate all drinking fountains in alcoves or within wing walls to ensure that they don't impede into pedestrian walkways. These protected areas must be 32 inches wide rather than our standard 30 inches wide, and 18 inches deep at a minimum. Wing walls act like an alcove where an alcove can't be installed or is retrofitted into place. So the wing walls must also project horizontally at least as far as the drinking fountain. While we're on the topic of Chapter 6, I should bring up that there is that the flow of water must also be within compliance from the equipment. The height of the stream of the water must at least be 4 inches to allow for a bottle or a glass to be filled for those who may be incapable of leaning over or don't have a bottle filler in place, which is typically most common nowadays. If you see a drinking fountain, it's really much more common and much more acceptable and popular nowadays to have that bottle filler in place, but we still need to make sure we have that minimum height on the stream of water. It also makes it a lot easier for someone to take a drink, obviously, especially when you're confined to a wheelchair. The less maneuvering and leaning and stuff you have to do in that wheelchair, the better. So we've got a few examples here. Alcoves, again, typically the issue when we see noncompliance or what is referred to as a drive-by lawsuit. In this installation, we have the low side installed on the right side and a large, what I'm told is a gas line. I haven't confirmed this, but that gas line is obstructing our toe and knee clearance underneath the fountain. This is awful. This could be fixed though, and pretty simply, and that's just by swapping the two fountains so that the clear floor space on the left is being used with the low side fountain, so long as there is 30 inches or 32 inches for California between the gas line and the wall on the left, and whatever that other valve is there on the left. But it looks like we'd have enough space. If we just swap those fountains, we should be more than compliant inside of this space. Likely this drinking fountains were installed after the alcove was designed. Maybe they decided we've got water here, let's throw some drinking fountains up, and weren't aware of the ADA accessible requirements for these fountains well after this area was designed. Here's another one. Those tiles behind the fountain are 2-inch tiles. And we only have 12 inches on the left low side between the center of the fountain and the wall, which means we are not meeting our minimum clear floor space. The wall is sitting directly in our clear floor space, obstructing access for the wheelchair users. And again, we don't need to make this any harder for anyone. These fountains could be repositioned further right. Again, the tile will probably look a little funky once you move those fountains, but if you shove them over to the right, we would have a much easier time meeting compliance for these. These fountains, so long as that is done, we should be just fine. But that would be the easiest fix on these guys. Here's a closer view of the issue that I'm trying to point out. So you got the arrows and the line there. So from the wall to the center of the fountain, we only have the 12 inches, where we need 15 inches minimum to meet our 30-inch clear floor space requirement. Currently, we're only meeting the 12 inches on the side, and which is not nearly enough space. We have all that space underneath the right side, so we're not concerned about that. It's just that wall on the left that we're concerned with. Again, reversing these could be the solution, but we've got that drain or whatever that is there on the right side would definitely obstruct our toe and knee clearance, so this would probably need to be redesigned. Here's another one. This example shows a high-low configuration with 4-inch tile in use behind the fountains. We can see clearly that the center line of the low side to the wall, that we only have 14 inches. Giving us only 29 inches of clearance, 15 on the left, 14 on the right. But that's not enough to make this a difficult approach. They may not have considered the thickness of the tile here when they finished the alcove. And again, they could move these over to bring them back into compliance. The high side not having floor clearance concerns could be shoved over closer to the wall to help fix this. Unless they want them centered too, then they'll need to redesign the alcove, which is a very costly fix. And remember, you typically find a high fountain and a low fountain in the same area because of access to water in your facility. It's not behind every wall, so they're typically together. But technically, you don't have to put these fountains together. Remember, you can have a low side on this end of the hallway, the high side on the other end of the hallway, so long as you're meeting the minimum requirements for the amount of drinking fountains in that area. You can separate them. They don't have to be next to each other. Okay, over to children's use for a moment. Section 602.2 gives us the maximum bubbler height of 30 inches and a 3.5-inch maximum depth for that bubbler. That's from the front edge of the fountain. So maximum bubbler depth, nobody is really designing these any differently as far as manufacturers go. But if you have a DIY drinking fountain or a on-the-counter, like deck-mounted bubbler head that somebody did themselves, you could run into issues with this. But it can't be any deeper than 3.5 inches from the front edge of the fountain. This also allows us to forego our previously mentioned knee and toe clearance so that we can lower the fountain where the users are intended to be children. There will be need to be a parallel approach and space for that available, though. Many states have their own requirements, though, for children's height, so be aware of that. Approach preference, so be sure to reference those local requirements before pulling a, well, Justin said so, to anybody, please. Many states don't allow for a parallel approach for children's fountains and require a front approach. Some even specify their own knee clearance heights locally, so be aware of that. That's one of the biggest differences between states. So let's move on to a couple more examples. Next, this one's got a lot wrong with it. There's so much wrong in this photo. Their intention was good here, but it was to install a high-low drinking fountain with a third child height fountain in a cascading design, but it's all mixed up and backwards and terrible. Good-looking fountains, though. Haws equipment, yeah. But realistically here, they got it all mixed up, and there's a much better way to accomplish this. But this installation, had it gone correctly, they would have had a height for adult for standing, adult wheelchair, and for a child height drinking fountain, but I'll show you how it's done here in a moment. Here is one of the biggest issues. The center, well, first, our clear floor space and our knee clearance isn't being is being obstructed by what they intended to be the child height fountain on the left, and which should have been the ADA fountain since it is a longer arm. Not only is the fountain way too short for our knees and toes to fit under, but a wheelchair is going to have a lot of trouble maneuvering to the fountain bubbler while it's hitting the left side fountain. So it's going to be way more difficult. The high-low combo unit on the left should have been installed over on the right, with the single fountain on the right installed on the left side, with enough room between it and the center fountain to meet our 30 inches of clear floor space. So here, I'll give you an example of how it's done. So I'm going to use our 1501 and our 1311 for this example. These are cast iron enameled fountains. You would typically find them in schools, medical facilities, things like that. They have that classic like schoolyard look. You know, anytime I see these, it always reminds me of school. Here is basically the mirror image of the example I just showed you earlier. The primary difference that is compliant. The 1311 high-low unit is installed over on the left as the standing and ADA fountain, with 22 inches between the center line of the center fountain and the child height fountain. Since that child height fountain is potentially a knee clearance issue, it has to be bumped over just a little bit to ensure that it is not going to impede the wheelchair accessing that space. So 22 inches, center line to center line, gives us more than enough space for access to the center fountain. Here you can see the outline of the 30 inches of the space we need. The high side doesn't offer any obstructions, so we just need to ensure that the child fountain is far enough away that it doesn't interfere with the wheelchair. Our clear floor space is a 3-dimensional space though. Really it's a 30 by 48 by 27 inch space basically under the wheelchair accessible fountain. And center line to center line would be 23 inches if we need to bump up our floor space to 32 inches for California. If you didn't care about the cascading design of the fountains, you could even take that child height fountain and place it over on the left side of the design. Then you would only need to ensure the wall to the right of the ADA fountain was far enough away and still center in the alcove without that cascading design. Next, there are a ton of different fountains, a wide variety of fountains out there that can be used to meet these requirements. It's top of mind for manufacturers like us to make sure that these are designed correctly. This one in particular is our 1107L. All of our fountains come in a single and dual installation design for adults, ADA, and child height designs. We can include all of the drawings and installation considerations in the world, compliant equipment, webinars like this one, but someone out there will still throw away the instructions and make poor compliance choices and give me more examples for my webinar. Ultimately, it really comes down to you and the installer to ensure that this is done correctly, right? So let's do a few outdoor examples now. This is our 3300 FR. It is a freeze protected unit, and someone installed it way too close to that wall. As you can see here, our clear floor space is obstructed. One might be able to pull off a hybrid parallel / forward approach to get a drink, but we don't need to see people improvise to get a drink of water. This needs to be moved away from the wall. If a field inspector or just an informed disabled person were to find this, it could mean a tear out, reinstall, and someone might have needed to leave feeling thirsty. So we need to make sure these installations are correct. Here's another example for outdoor compliance. This fountain, for example, has an adjustable arm that can be adjusted for either adult ADA or child height arm ADA. So these are incredibly common in public parks, especially because of their ability to accommodate both ADA and children. When installing these fountains, considering the approach and direction of the bubbler head, they're both important factors to ensure compliance. So make sure you're taking into consideration all the measurements of the fountain, what direction you have to approach those fountains from, where the buttons are, where the bubbler heads are, and how your path needs to look to make this compliant. Alrighty, each of the following examples are going to be compliant. Above, we have, this is a 3150. If the 3150 or any other outdoor fountain is installed against a wall, a building, railing structure, whatever it is, the center line of the wheelchair accessible fountain, remember that's our focus really, it needs to be a minimum of 15 inches from the wall to give us our 30 inches of clear ground space. And we'll of course need 48 inches out from the base of the fountain to allow for easy access to the fountain. Hopefully nobody is surprised by this, but it doesn't take much to make it difficult to utilize a drinking fountain from a wheelchair. So same as indoor installations, we need to have our available knee and toe clearance available under the fountain as well. Lastly, so no difference, indoor, outdoor, doesn't matter. Lastly, I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, but on the bottom middle is our visual representation of the clear space for the high side fountain of 30 by 30 inches. Again, this is not required, but it is a generally agreed upon space that is necessary for accessibility. And since it's intended for those with stooping or bending disabilities, then we need to assume that the other devices may be in play here. Again, canes, walkers, things like that. And we need to make space available to access the bubbler head and the walking devices. They could, of course, make it a bit more difficult in the space if that 30 by 30 inches isn't provided. So just keep that top of mind. Again, it's not in the ADA, but it is a general agreed upon space and average size for a lot of those devices, especially walkers. Common practice in public parks is to just pour a pad of concrete, specifically for the fountain to help remove the fountain from the pedestrian walkway and give users a firm surface to stand on, or for the wheelchair users, a firm surface for the wheels to avoid the difficulty that dirt or grass could provide for access. In this example, you can clearly see that the path of travel on the left side, which will provide easy access to the low side fountain. If the orientation of the fountain were any different in this exact layout, access to the fountain would be pretty difficult. To fit the fountain perfectly here, to include both wheelchair free ground space and the high side fountain space, we need a pad that is 69 by 52 inches deep and wide. With the low side, again, facing the path of travel for an easy forward approach. So preference is always given to that low side fountain for the wheelchair user to make sure that that's the priority as far as access goes to these drinking fountains. Different example this time, but with wing walls, or these could be guardrails in place. All requirements remain the exact same here for the approach. Still favoring a forward approach since it's the easiest way to do it. Unfortunately, many installations prioritize the high side and like to think unintentionally making the low side difficult to access, unfortunately. Remember that the guardrails need to extend at least far enough so that no part of the fountain protrudes outside of the reach of the rails. This is all an effort to make the unit easily detectable and to keep it out of path of travel. Those with a detection cane would detect the guardrails and know that there is something that they can interact with there. There's something that we're calling attention to, and that's what we want to accomplish with those guardrails. This is just a short lineup of some of the models and examples that Haws has to offer to make compliant installations possible. Not to mention our ability to run specials to fit unique situations and areas, which is often necessary. There's a solution for just about everything, and I bet we can help you find it. Just remember that the design of the fountain is going to typically be very important for your installation area, traffic, and not to mention the type of facility or area that it is that you are making accessible. Speaking of options, this is a newer offering that I'm going to use to demonstrate a few compliant configurations with. The great part about this particular fountain is that it's highly modular, and it gives us the ability to easily adapt the fountain to different installations and situations. The arms, bowls, bottle fillers can be indexed in different directions to give us some flexibility with design for different areas. So our 3600 in this example is an ADA and child height configuration with a bottle filler in the center, well within accessible limits. The bottle filler, of course, could be swapped out for a fountain, say accommodating standing persons in a park. ADA and child heights in one fountain. So like in the example, we just need to make sure that the fountain is far enough away from any obstruction, like the wall or fence in this illustration, to ensure that we have our clear floor space. Clear floor space is always top of mind during the installation. This is giving us our forward approach and our right hand over on our right hand side. So you can see the clear floor space underneath the fountain. And then we need to make sure that that approach too from the right side of the fountain is easy for whoever it is that's going to be approaching the fountain. For those who may not be aware, the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design was actually derived from ANSI. It was A117.1 2009 standard. Currently, the updates that these standards last received included the addition of bottle filling stations to the drinking fountains, section 602 that you see on the screen. So 602.4 indicates that bottle fillers have to adhere to 602.4.1 and .2 regarding, and I'll remind you what those are. Those are clear floor space, and which again is our 30 by 48 inches, and that the controls for these need to be either hand operated or automatic and be within our reach ranges. I go over all that in a moment, though. There is also an exception on this page stating that if the bottle filler is installed on both the high and low side fountains, then the high side doesn't need to comply with this section, which is due to the fact that our low side bottle filler is accessibly installed. But it's pretty rare to see an installation like that, though. With that in mind, if a bottle filler is not provided for both fountains, which is generally the case, then the one bottle filler, which is more common, is the most common installation, must be located on the low side. That's to allow access to the wheelchair-bound people. Since if the bottle filler is on the low side, we can assure that everybody can reach it. And if located on the high side, we're going to make access very difficult for people in wheelchairs. So when installing the bottle filler, priority has to be given to that low side drinking fountain. That's where it's going to go. And not typically the high side. Otherwise, it's going to be really difficult to access. Two bottle fillers is perfectly fine, though, especially in high traffic areas or where fountains are separated by some distance. Lastly, we need to ensure clear floor space and that the controls are well within our appropriate reach ranges, whether a fountain is in place or not. Next, I'm going to use this guy as an example. This is our 1920 bottle filler. This will be in the next few examples. These little devices are retrofittable, which makes it perfect for this example for on our equipment or competitors' equipment. Since they're just stainless steel, they blend right in. So remember my product plug from earlier? This is the 1117 LN. With our 1920 bottle filler over the low side fountain, accessible to all, well within our reach ranges, and in keeping with what we just covered. So priority is on the left side fountain. We have to make sure that it's accessible on that side. Those that are standing, it's reasonable to think that they could access it at either height. It doesn't matter. All we need to ensure here is that the button on the front is reachable, and then the activator is either hand operated or automatic. Now, the only reason I bring that up, and I know what you're thinking, Justin, what other kind is there? What they're trying to accomplish here is avoiding foot, knee, or other body part activation whatever that happens to be, parts of the body that would be difficult for those to utilize in a wheelchair to activate this equipment. So this needs to be as easy as possible, which is why they add that verbiage, hand or automatic. Even with all this said, I'm sure the standard will change eventually. We could all do a much better job as it is. It's easy for us. We need to make sure it's easy for others as well. In accordance with 308.2.2, our reach ranges, the activation for the bottle filler is located at 46 inches. That's below our required 48 inches that we covered earlier. Remember, this is a maximum height. Since it is a maximum height, the activator can be located anywhere between the fountain and the bottle filler. But since we have that fountain in place, it can't be any lower because once we have an object in place, our low reach range dissipates. It's gone. So not below the fountain. If there are no fountains installed or no obstructions under the bottle filler, we can install the activator as low as 15 inches based on our reach ranges. But that would also be impractical and it'd look kind of funky. And you'd have to balance the bottle and stuff, and that's not ideal. So remember that we get 48 inches reach here because the installed fountain is not exceeding 20 inches from the wall. Most fountains are about 18 to 20 inches from the wall. If an element is in place that fell into the 20 to 25 range, keep in mind that our reach range goes down to 44 inches. But again, usually that only applies to other elements. Drinking fountains are always within that 18 to 20 inches. This is another common installation, model 1501. This one mostly popular, again, with schools due to its white enameled surface, which is the intent is for it to stay cooler to prevent kids from burning themselves on the hot stainless steel that's been sitting in the sun. Especially ideal for outdoor wall-mounted ADA configurations, since the fountain itself is usually used to support the person getting a drink from a wheelchair. So oftentimes they are grabbing the fountain, leaning on the fountain, and using it to pull themselves up, etc., to ensure that it's as easy as possible. So we want it to be cool to the touch if it's in an outdoor area. On the indoor area, that's why mounting frames and things like that are so important. And when you hear about drinking fountain manufacturers saying, oh, this will support 300 plus pounds, that's the reason why. We have people that are going to use these to help support themselves when they take a drink or pull themselves up from, say, a wheelchair. It makes this really an important factor when it comes into this type of equipment. Here, this is just a single 1311 fountain that could really easily be used as our third child height fountain, or as a standalone ADA fountain, or a high side fountain, all depending on what your facility's needs were and what need it's trying to fill. Speaking of child height, remember that children are defined as 12 or under. Here, we're utilizing the age range of 9 to 12. Our reach range maximum would be 44 inches here. The bubbler head has to be at a maximum of 30 inches or below for a child height fountain at the spout, not the top of the bubbler head. As you can see on the screen, our bottle filler activation is at 42 and 5/8 from the floor, well below our 44-inch max, and the bubbler head is at 30 inches, well within compliance. This wouldn't do in an adult ADA situation unless raised, obviously, since the fountain would be an obstruction to our knee and toe clearance, or well, our knee clearance, and the bottle filler would be unreachable. It would just need to be raised and would fall into compliance for that type of situation. Again, another example with a different design in mind, more of a front lobby look to this guy. This would be a fully compliant 1011 MS and 1020 or 1920 bottle filler, given that the contractor, plumber, or whoever is installing it read the instructions, not to mention that the area was designed correctly. We all make mistakes. Ultimately, it's up to you to ensure that this is done correctly and that those with disabilities are kept in mind while we are doing it and getting these on the wall. Lastly, keep in mind that we have these chilling technology too for those units as well. Our HCR chiller can be remotely placed to supply a fountain with chilled water while leaving bottom of the fountain completely obstruction free. Remember, if you see chillers, any obstructions, items like that underneath fountains, those have to be hidden behind the wall or attached to the fountain in a way that it's not obstructing toe and knee clearance like an electric water cooler. I just like to end on this one. We're going to move into the Q&A section of the webinar. Remember to submit your questions if you still have them. If you saved them up, send them in. Any that I don't get to will be answered in that follow-up email I mentioned. I like to end with this photo since it's installed right in our backyard in the Reno International Airport. And it's just a really great example of a high-low with a bottle filler. Hopefully this was useful for everyone and you maybe feel a bit more knowledgeable. Remember that equal access is, to this day, not always taken into consideration. So take this information you've gotten today and be advocates for awareness. We've got our poll question and FAQ that I might skip based on time constraints. I'm getting a nod from Nicole, so yes, we're going to skip that. And of course, our Q&A left at the end. So let's get through our last poll question, we'll get to the Q&A.
All right, thanks for hanging in there, guys. So what percentage of the time do you specify a bottle filler when specifying a drinking fountain? All right, let's see, give me just one more second here. And it looks like we are going to go a little past 11, so thanks for staying on. If you'd like to hear the Q&A, we're going to go ahead and get that started now. And I'm going to go ahead and hop right into the questions that I have. Let's see, let me head up to the top here. Okay, can floor-mounted detection be installed in a way that will not obstruct the clear space needed for wheelchairs?
So actually, would you repeat that one more time? I want to make sure I understand completely.
Sure. Yeah, so can floor-mounted cane detection be installed in a way that will not obstruct the clear space needed for wheelchairs?
Yes, absolutely you can. So what we're primarily trying to accomplish is for them to detect whatever that device is before the drinking fountain, right? So, and that's the point of an alcove too, and it works the same way. When you're following a shoreline with a detection cane and your cane all of a sudden detects nothing, the wall is gone, there's something here, it's a room, it's an alcove, there's a turn, I can use the detection cane and I can discover what is over there. A floor-mounted device would work in much the same way. It's going to allow you to detect the devices before the drinking fountain, and can be installed in a way that it will not obstruct toe clearance or knee clearance, from floor mounted to cane skirts and things like that. They can be installed in such a way that they are non-obstructive.
Great.
Especially since that device it's under the high side fountain, which is most important, since we don't have toe clearance needs underneath that fountain.
Okay. So the next question is if only one drinking fountain is required by code, does that drinking fountain have to be by level? Is a single level drinking fountain allowed? Is there any situation where one single level is okay? One single fountain.
No, it's not. ADA overrides this. If you are required to have a single drinking fountain within your facility, per capita, your building's small enough, you only need one drinking fountain, right? But you're required to have that one drinking fountain, you have to have two. There has to be equal access to that water within your facility. It's a basic human need. Everybody has to have access to that, and to deny some people access to it would be terrible. But also, you have to think, have I granted access to my facility which is almost the more important question. So if you have not, if your facility is not an accessible facility, there's no chance that somebody in a wheelchair will need to access your lobby, your facility, then you're fine. Yes, technically there's a situation. Maybe I answered too harshly. First, no, but it's in that situation, yeah, you could have a single drinking fountain. That's absolutely fine. It could be at adult or ADA sitting wheelchair height. And that's only in situations where you have not granted access.
Great. So when are bottle fillers required by the ADA?
Bottle fillers are not at all required by the ADA. That is, drinking fountains are required by the ADA. Bottle filler is an accessory. It's a nice way to, and most people prefer to use that bottle filler nowadays, but a drinking fountain is more ideal and will be for the foreseeable future until people have automatically are carrying bottles with them and cups with them. Which is why those are mandatory, and a bottle filler is just a nice accessory to that bottle filler or to the drinking fountain. So not required, and absolutely does not replace a drinking fountain. You cannot replace a drinking fountain with a bottle filler. So it's just an accessory. It's a nice way to add on accessible or a way to get water onto that existing drinking fountain.
Great. Okay. So I'm gonna try to ask this as best as possible, but you probably know what this means when you hear it. Will bottle fillers substitute the need for HC fountain in any application? And I believe you just answered that question.
I did.
HC.
Yeah, a bottle filler never ever replaces a drinking fountain in any situation. If you're required to have drinking fountains, if you're required to have one, ADA overrides that. You're required to have two. You cannot get rid of those drinking fountains. You have to have those on your property. A bottle filler, a tanked bottle filler, anything like that never ever replaces a drinking fountain. I've seen people try to get away with those hot cold water dispensers with the tank on top. Those don't count. It has to be a plumbed source of water that's accessible.
Okay. All right. So this is going to be the last question. Who would be responsible for catching non-compliance and enforcing it?
That is everybody. Everybody is responsible, but technically speaking, the Department of Justice is the agency that is responsible for following through on this, and the people that are responsible for this standard and enforcing it. But realistically, anybody that is well informed, knows the standard, knows the differences, and has a tape measure on them, is responsible for making sure that these are accessible. A well-informed individual in a wheelchair approaches something, it's not accessible, the likelihood that that person will follow through, take the measurements, inform people that this is not accessible it's likely. It can absolutely happen. We need to exclude a whole class of people and make access more difficult for them. So everybody is responsible for it, but the Department of Justice is in charge of enforcing it.
Great. All right. Thanks for submitting your questions. As Justin mentioned, the Q&A will be sent out in the next couple of days. We need to combine them, clean them up, and then provide the answers. So we will be sending those out in another email.
So with that said, thank you everybody for attending. We really appreciate it. I hope this was helpful and informative for everybody, and that you have a great day. So reach out to us if you need anything, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.